Oh, what's this? It's my old Lunar review? And that was such a good video. It totally deserves to be re-seen again and again by the public, and totally deserved to exist in the public circle. Deleted! Oh, that felt great. It was about a decade ago that one of my biggest inspirations for video making suggested to me that I try reviewing this game that I spent a lot of time cramming down people's throats back then. It was called Lunar Silver Star Story Complete! He suggested this because he thought it would help me showcase my train of thought as a critic, and as anyone who watched the video back then can likely tell you, I failed miserably. It'd be like if I made a video trying to get more people to watch Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and spent half the review complaining about the scene with Gonzo tripping in the bathtub. I didn't do the game justice at all. Well, you know what? It's time for a do-over. It's time to do this game some justice. While it is fairly common knowledge that this was a remake of a Sega CD game, I haven't played it, so I have no clue whether or not Silver Star Story is better or worse. For that matter, I also haven't played the PSP remake that this game eventually got. The only other version I've played is the Game Boy Advance remake, and it plays about as well as you would expect. All I can tell you for certain is that on its own, this game is superb. The original PlayStation was known for having a lot of great RPGs, and this is one that deservedly gets mentioned quite a bit in those conversations. And yet, its legacy is that of a cult classic, a game that has some dedicated fans but generally tends to go ignored by the general gaming community. A lot of this has to do with how new entries in the franchise have been rare, and the newest one, which came out in 2005, was apparently so bad that it brought whatever momentum the franchise had to a grinding halt. But if you ask me, all it would take to breathe new life into this franchise is to bring this game back to the public eye. The gameplay is pretty standard fare for an RPG. Beat monsters, level up, learn new abilities, keep lots of healing items on hand, all that stuff. What sets this apart from its contemporaries, however, is that the distance between your party and your enemies plays into the combat and places extra emphasis on the importance of special attacks. As the game progresses, you almost start to forget that it's there because you can afford to spam special attacks, but it's a nice detail that keeps things interesting. Not to mention, points in this game where it's necessary to level grind are few and far between. The game's hard, but it's fair. Any moments where the game does start to become cheap wind up being done fairly quickly, including the biggest example, which just so happens to be the final boss. The overworld graphics aren't really anything special for its time. I mean, a lot of reviews from back when the game first came out compared it to SNES graphics, but the anime cutscenes are a whole different story. The animation work in this game is just downright exquisite. It's actually pretty easy to forget that this was animated in the mid-90s. Whether it be always being on point with the characters' intricate outfits, the great attention to detail, or even weaving in some 3D animation, there's always something in these cutscenes that makes them worth watching. Which brings me to the story. The storylines generally tend to be the part of any RPG that gets the most attention by both developers and players alike, so it would have to be able to draw people in if it's gonna work. And let me tell you, this game excels at that with flying colors. Despite the setting and world building seemingly just being the standard fantasy setting you'd find in an RPG, it's hard for me to think of any game that's gotten me more invested in what's happening. I mean, let me put it to you this way, there aren't a whole lot of games out there that can actually make a damsel in distress plot work. I think the important distinction here is that Luna actually has far more depth to her as a character than just, I baked you a cake! And all the other central characters in the game, including Alex, the often mute protagonist, are given proper time to show what they're all about as characters. Especially so with my personal favorite character, Kyle. Despite spending a lot of the game getting drunk and arguing with his girlfriend, there's a lot of moments in the game where he's shown to have genuine depth as a character, rather than being just some apathetic asshole. Plus, there's a lot of moments in the game where he's funny as hell, way too many to count. The way the story plays out isn't something groundbreakingly original, but if you ask me, it never needed to be. It just needed to know how to make the pieces fit right. As I've touched upon before, the whole damsel in distress shtick is one of the most tedious and overused cliches in writing, so it's pretty cool to actually see a game do it right. Well, about as right as you can do it. Since Alex doesn't talk a whole lot in this game, there aren't many moments where you actually see him visibly get distressed by what's happening to Luna, but when they do, man do they hit. Especially my personal favorite cutscene from this game. It seems like you've beaten the final boss and you're about to see the ending, but then it becomes apparent that Luna's been brainwashed and shit hits the fan.
You shouldn't have interfered. Haven't you figured it out? There's no way to stop this.
As if the visual of the sweet, innocent girl you'd known up to this point suddenly becoming psychotic, scantily dressed, and yet strangely badass wasn't enough, we're also treated to some incredible visual work for the time, and the revelation that Galleon's still alive.
Why not stay dead?
Most RPGs tend to have at least one big moment where the plot thickens like crazy, and this is one of the best out there. And even though I've repeatedly expressed my disdain for the game's final battle, what comes afterward is certainly heartwarming enough to take the edge off. With all that out of the way, one aspect about this game's translation that remains a point of contention among the fans to this day is the use of pop culture references in a fantasy setting. I mean, I do get it, like, it would be pretty weird if in The Witcher some random kid just out of nowhere expresses his admiration for CM Punk. It remains somewhat controversial to this day, but it's hardly what I would call distracting. It hardly ever happens, and it only ever happens during non-mandatory conversations. On the whole, the writing is solid, and this is punctuated by great voice acting delivered by unknown VAs during a time where most game developers just didn't give a shit about getting good voice performances.
What am I fighting for?
Why did they have to do Zero dirty like that? And finally, let's delve into the music. Given that the most well-known thing about this game is a cutscene with a full-on musical number, it should stand to reason that the soundtrack would be great. And a lot of it is, with my personal favorite being the final level's music. But while we're breaching the subject of sound design, the one singular thing about this game that bothers me is the repetitive one-liners that you'd hear in battle. I've spent the last decade cultivating a running gag in my videos about how annoying Galleon's one-liner is in the finale. In fact, I think I'm gonna keep the gag going.
Time to die.
Shut up, bitch!
But even though he's the most egregious offender, he's far from the only example. Not only are there a couple other bosses that spout the same line over and over, but even your own player characters do this too. Jessica's by far the worst offender, especially punctuated by the fact that she's the medic. 99% of the time she isn't attacking, she's healing the rest of the team. By the time you finish the game, you'll probably have heard this line.
Althena, lend me your power!
Well into the triple digits. I get it, she's a priestess, not to mention she's a good character. Seeing her bicker with Kyle is funny, but like, does she have to say that every time she casts a healing spell? I mean, in universe the answer is probably yes, but could they have just forgone the dialogue in battle entirely? What am I saying? This game is still awesome. If there's one thing to take from this game, it's that even if there isn't a whole lot in the way of originality as far as world building goes, the important thing is what you do with the pieces that are in place. You could probably find a lot of games out there with similar aesthetics and gameplay, but aside from this game being one of the first of its kind to reach Western shores, I would argue that a lot of its successors are still struggling to catch up to it. Maybe not from a gameplay standpoint, but certainly when it comes to being engaging. Even if you've seen it all when it comes to JRPG tropes, or if you're like me and you were too young to be able to play this game when it first came out, there's still a lot of value to be found here. Bottom line is, you really ought to play this game. Assuming you have the money for it. Issues with accessibility have severely plagued this game in the years since its release. Used copies of this game sell for absurd amounts of money, and there hasn't been any re-releases on modern consoles, despite other Working Designs games being readily released on the PlayStation Network. Victor Ireland, the head of Working Designs, mentioned as far back as 2013 that he was working to get this game and its sequel onto the PlayStation Network, but it's 2022 and nothing's come of it. There's been a couple of remakes that have come out since then, but I can tell you for certain that the first of them is just a cheap bastardization of the original. The other one definitely looks better, and I've been wanting to play it for quite some time now, but based on what I've seen, there are a few things about it that have noticeably changed for the worse. Getting back to what I said earlier on in this video, Lunar is a dead franchise, and the only way to resuscitate it would be to make the games that made it a cult classic readily available once again. Even though it never reached the levels of Final Fantasy, Pokemon, or the Tales series, it's still got a small but dedicated following that still cares about it. A following that will no doubt become sizably larger if we can just get some re-releases. I mean, hey, far stranger comebacks have happened. Cue the outro!
Come on, let me hear you say it just once. Come on.
My coming out party can begin.
No! No, the other thing. Come on, I know it's just dangling off the tip of your tongue. Let me hear it just once, please.
Time to die.
Wrong!